Um, since we're getting a little bit of a later start on it, I'm gonna jump right in. I guess first I'll say, do you guys have any real estate questions that have come up since our last class? Okay. If anything comes up, feel free to shoot me a text or something. Um, or just jot down your questions and we'll discuss them next time. Um, okay, so today we're going to be discussing just some ideas, some things to think about when you're writing and submitting an offer in order to make it as strong as possible. There's some do's, there's some don'ts, but if you set it up well initially, it's so much better um, than having to amend it and fix things later or think about things later. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this won't work. Um, so um, I would say, as a general rule of thumb, aim for as few addendums as possible when you're thinking about it. But most contracts will have an addendum or two um, initially, especially if you've got someone who's doing FHA or VA. You'll have those. If you have earnest money held at a title company, you'll have that. Personally, when I'm working with buyers, I would rather have my buyers hold their money at our brokerage trust account because then we don't require the seller's signature in order to return their earnest money if a deal falls through. Um, let's see. Um, there are a bunch of there's interesting things. You'll see a bunch of interesting things. You'll have clients who bring up really interesting things. Sometimes you'll have addenda and offers that are going to look super weird. Um, 2 years ago, I had a client who was selling a home, but the buyer who submitted an offer asked specifically that they not clean out the manure in the chicken run. Um, and because they wanted to use it as fertilizer in the garden. But anyways, it was super weird and oddly specific. I don't know that my clients were like necessarily planning on shoveling out the chicken run because it wasn't awful, it was a chicken run. Um but that came through in a contract. And so we're like, okay, sure, we won't do that. Um so you might see some interesting things. It's going to be different depending on your buyers, how those are going to look. So how can you present the best offer possible? Sometimes you have to kind of put yourself in the seller's shoes. You need to be um, read the remarks and the agent remarks for each listing very closely, because if they're like motivated seller, that's going to give you a clue. If they're saying something like seller's already moved, if it's vacant, you'll be like, oh, they might be more motivated to sell. So you'll want to look at the listing first. And I usually do that before I show the homes, as I look at the listing and I try to glean what I can from the way the agent has put the listing together. Um, if it's the beginning and it's just newly listed, you're like, hey, we probably want to go see it quick. It looks like it's priced well. Um, we'll want to hurry. And should my client want to make an offer, we'll have to consider um, our offer really carefully, because if it's newly listed, they're probably not going to give a lot because they're hoping to get what they want. But if it's something that's been sitting much longer and I take clients through, I'll be mentioning to my client, hey, it's sat for this long. Maybe there's an explanation for why in the remarks, or maybe I just think they're priced high, or maybe the market's just really slow and we could probably, negotiate on some other things. So in order to come up with the best offer possible, you'll want to understand the seller priorities. And this is when you're working with buyers. Buyers are your client in this instance, but you need to be able to understand the seller's priorities. Um, some of that, like I mentioned, can be gleaned from the listing, from the remarks, from the days on market. If it's gone under contract and fallen through during the first week multiple times, you might instantly say, oh, there's probably due diligence, but my client's really handy and is not afraid of that. So maybe we can negotiate on other things. Um, the other way, if you're not pulling things from the listing that will give you ideas of the seller's priorities, if you don't get a full picture from the listing, which I would say most of the time you won't get a full picture from the listing, you really should be calling the listing agent. Before you submit an offer, please, 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 if at all possible, call the listing agent and have a conversation. Say, hey, I took my clients through, they really liked it. Or if you know you're going to have really tight timelines with your client, you could call them before and say, hey, I really like your listing for my client. I think they're going to love it. What are the most important things for your seller? They might come at you with closing timeline. Do they need the timeline to be fast, or do they really need it to be flexible? Or do they need it to be set out a while and just get everything done except closing? Um, do they, most of the time they'll say we want fewer contingencies. Many sellers don't want your clients to have a home sale contingency in order to go under contract, or at least they'll want the home your clients are selling to be listed. Sometimes they'll want it under contract already. So check in on contingencies. Sometimes this one's much less common, but sometimes the agent will be like, we want a good amount of earnest money to show that you're interested. Most agents are realizing that while earnest money is great and important, it needs to happen. Um, that's not something that we're seeing a big demand on right now, just because the market is slower. Um, but you're welcome to have that conversation and say, hey, my client would be looking at putting 1% down for earnest money. Um, just kind of having those conversations. Lease back, find out if the seller needs to lease the home back for any period of time after closing, because that can be a huge thing. If your client has the flexibility to offer the sellers a lease back, that can win you, um, in a multiple offer situation. That's probably the most common thing that has um, that has won it before me, besides just upping the price. So does the seller need a lease back? Does the seller need 2 days after closing in order to move? If they're buying and close or buying and selling on the same day, maybe they need 24 hours to be out. Check in with the listing agent, see if that would be a point that your client could concede on, that might mean a lot to the sellers, but may not be super detrimental to your client, especially if they're first time home buyers. Lots of time the client will have a few extra days and they'll say, yeah, that's not a big deal. We'll just move in the next week or the next weekend or whatever. Um, Lender, occasionally you'll have agents who will be like, we really don't, like, we need to make sure your lender's on point. One thing I'd be cautious with when you're working with buyers, if you're working with banks or credit unions, you can absolutely do that. But if I receive a pre-qual from Wells Fargo, um, on a listing that I have, I will do almost anything to accept a different offer, just because I've had so many poor experiences with big banks. Um, Credit unions less, but mortgage brokers have always done a much better job for me, and we have fewer curveballs. I feel like every time my client uses Wells Fargo, um, or every time my buyers on the other side use Wells Fargo, it always takes so much longer to close. Um, so that's something that could come up. You probably won't have that come up in the conversation, but making sure your buyers have a good lender is great, because if your lender has a really poor reputation, it's going to reflect on your buyers. Okay, so make sure you have that conversation. Um, Price is important, but price is not always everything. And if the price is equal, these are the things that matter to the sellers that could bump you over and make you have a stronger offer, or make them more excited about your offer. Because if the sellers can be excited about your offer, then they're going to be much more flexible throughout the process, because bumps come up. Like, bumps come up, curveballs come up, it happens. Um, so this is something that, setting it up now to be a smooth transaction and to have everyone be excited from the beginning without your buyers having to give on things that they can't give on or don't want to give on. Um, this is a good way to go about it. You can usually find a win-win. Okay. As far as finding out those, have a conversation with the listing agent. Genuine conversations work. I mean, if you need a script, you can say, what is the most important thing, or the most important two things for your sellers when they're reviewing offers. Um, and just take note. Um, let's see. Um, I already said to read the agent marks in the MLS, looking for hidden clues. When it comes to writing a clean offer, you've got price, terms, earnest money, deadlines, contingencies. Those are the main components of an offer. Price, make sure it's competitive based on comps. We are in a fairly balanced budget, so I haven't for the past 18 months or so seen a buyer offer over the price range that I think it could appraise at. I mean, I've seen them offer everywhere in the price range, sometimes on the low side, sometimes on the high side. But right now, we're not seeing buyers say, "Oh my gosh, I have to have this house or I have to have a house, so I'm willing to pay 10,000 over appraised value." Right now, we're not seeing that. So when you go to write an offer, pull at least basic comps on the property to say, yeah, it's pretty well priced. If you can do it before your showings, I would, because then you can go into the home and say, hey, this one's priced pretty well. Um, when you're new, you'll want to pull comps in order to know that. If you're seeing a lot of properties that meet the same criteria, you might be working predominantly in one county, and let's say you get really used to Lehigh, and you've seen a gazillion 3-bed, 2-bath townhomes in Lehigh. Um, you may be able to get a pretty good idea after you've done that for a while and pulled comps on the first ones. Then you may be able to move on and say, hey, this one is super comparable to the ones that we've seen, but this one's in nicer condition, but it's listed at the same price. So this one's a good buy. But until you're confident in saying that, you really want to make sure that you're pulling comps before you submit offers. Um, let's see. Um, make sure that you know where you are in submitting an offer. Are you competing and grateful to be considered? Or are you writing the offer from a position of power? If it's a multiple offer situation and you visit with the listing agent, those still do happen. Um, then you're coming from a position of, okay, if my client wants this house, how do I get it for them? But if it's a house that's sat for quite a while and they haven't had any offers, you come in from a position of relative power, and you can come in and you can say, hey, well, what can your sellers give on? My client's concerned that it's sat this long. Have you thought about price reductions? Um, and if they were about ready to do a price reduction, sometimes they'll let that slip and you'll be like, oh, well, what were you going to reduce the price to? And they may actually tell you, and you're like, we would feel much more comfortable offering at that price. But you need to know if you're coming into the situation from a position of power or a position where you're just super lucky to be considered. Um, earnest money, typically 1 to 3% of purchase price. Always protect your client's earnest money through contingencies. Make sure you are on deck. Absolutely set alarms in your phone when you get a house under contract. Set an alarm in your phone for each deadline that will affect your buyer's earnest money. And then set the timer to remind you 2 days before that, so you can make sure that any last minute negotiations have happened and that your client's earnest money is safe. That's one of the things I see most often with new agents, is forgetting about their deadlines because the lender's on point. Yeah, we're totally going to close. But then all of a sudden your client's earnest money is going hard. And then what happens if your client loses their job? Then their earnest money's gone. Or what happens if your client gets cold feet and their earnest money is gone? Or what happens if the appraisal comes in low and you haven't been monitoring your deadlines to see if you need to extend that deadline, and all of a sudden the appraisal comes in low, your client's earnest money is hard, and the seller could just put the property back on the market and keep your client's earnest money if they don't want to renegotiate a lower price and your client can't come up with the excess. So there's all sorts of reasons to make sure that your buyer's earnest money is protected. Inspection contingency. I personally would never waive a home inspection. And I would never recommend to a client that they waive a home inspection. Even on a new build, I recommend to my clients that they have an independent home inspector come through and take a look at the property. If they're building through the whole process, sometimes I'll say, hey, maybe have your inspector go through while the walls are open. that might be more effective for what they're concerned about. Um, but I always have an inspection contingency. 7 to 10 days is really pretty standard. Up to 2 weeks is also acceptable to most sellers right now because there's not a ton of buyers. But if you've got a bunch of people offering and you're in a multiple offer situation, I probably wouldn't request more than 10 days unless your client's already sitting there going, well, I'm going to want to have a meth test. I'm going to want to bring in a structural engineer. I'm going to want to bring in an inspector. I'm going to want to schedule the sewer scope. I mean, if you have a plan of attack, they could do all of that in 7 to 10 days. But if they've got a big list of things that they for sure are going to inspect, you may want to bump it out to 2 weeks. Um, let's see. I would never do it less than a week for due diligence, just because sometimes inspectors are booked out a few days. And then I always want to have at least 2 days to negotiate um, repairs and then still allow for 24 hours for documents to be signed once I send them over to the sellers. Um, okay, the appraisal contingency, unless your buyer is a fully cash offer, I would not waive the appraisal contingency. We did see that back some in 2023 when people had big down payments. They were like, hey, I can take the higher mortgage or I can pay the excess in cash. Um, but homes are expensive enough right now that we're not seeing that. And I really probably wouldn't recommend it. So I would keep the appraisal contingency unless your client has the cash and is planning to use the cash. Some buyers are like, well, I could buy it without taking out a loan, but they're planning on taking out a loan. I would talk to them about the risks, and only if they are certain that they can close just fine without a loan, that's the only time when I would waive the appraisal contingency. Same with financing contingency. Closing date, make sure you're specific. If you're writing an offer for a backup position, your offer will go out in number of days from notification of the primary offer falling through. So that can be a little bit ambiguous. So if you are in a backup position and your contract is written by number of days, occasionally if you're buying from a company that auctions things, occasionally they'll have it set that you say how many days from notification of acceptance of an offer. The first thing I would do if it was in that instance, once they inform you that you are under contract, I would absolutely create an addendum to nail down those dates so everyone's on the same page. Have deadlines fall on business days in case you need to address something last minute with the lender or the title company. I had one offer where I wasn't paying attention and I had settlement deadline listed as a Sunday. And obviously that's not going to fly. Nobody's open on a Sunday. And it ended up not being a big deal because we were ready to close on Friday, but I looked like kind of a doofus for having a settlement deadline on a Sunday. So I would check, make sure they fall on business days, be very mindful of bank holidays when you are writing offers, just because if you're really crunching the timeline and you have settlement on a bank holiday that's a Monday, that could cause some really big issues because then you have to close several days sooner and all of a sudden the lender's like, we can't make that work. Let's see. Clean offer checklist. Make sure all blanks are filled in. Ambiguity is your enemy in contracts. The only things that I would say are different is what we discussed last week in the Rep C. If there's like a down payment in cash, you can say to be determined. If there's how much of it is going to be financed, you can write to be determined on that. But I wouldn't leave things blank. If there's something that's not applicable, I would write not applicable or just write NA in the blank because I've never had it happen, but I always worry about someone adding things to our contracts afterwards or without permission. And so I like to make sure that the blanks have something in it, even if it's not applicable or zero. Make sure the dates make sense. The inspection should be before the appraisal deadline. Make sure that the seller's disclosures are received in enough time that they can look over them before their inspection. So, usually in the first few days after acceptance. Make sure the buyer and seller names are spelled correctly because that will always need to be fixed in an addendum. And remember from last time to always include the seller's name on the rep sheet. Don't be lazy and write owner of record. Even if the seller put that on the listing, don't do it. Go to the county docs, figure out what it's under legally, or ask the listing agent, because sometimes it'll be under one thing on the county. Um, but like if it's a divorce situation and they're in the act of signing a quick claim deed or something, then they may want it written just to one of the sellers. Anyway, so that's a good one to check on or to go to the county website. Um, Make sure that the earnest money deposit is listed. And if you're planning on holding it at a title company, make sure you have the addendum for that. Um, let's see, before you submit an offer, when you're trying to decide on dates, by this point, you should have already had a conversation with the lender. You should have said, how many days do you need to close? If we find a home in their price range, how many days do you need to close? Or how many days do you need for the financing and appraisal deadline? And how many days do you need to close? So make sure you're aware of that and that you consider that when you're writing an offer. Clear communication with your clients while submitting an offer is really important. Sometimes I'll get them on the phone with me to walk through the offer once I've got it drafted, but before I send it over, make sure they understand all the terms and that the only way we can change terms after the document's all accepted and fully executed, we can only change terms with everybody's permission. Explain the contingencies in plain language. When I am talking to clients like outside the house or something afterwards, and they're like, we absolutely want to make an offer, I say, okay, what I need you to do while I'm driving back to my office is I need you to text me the price, the amount of earnest money, um, and any inclusions that you want, so that I have them in writing. And then the other stuff we just kind of talk through. Make sure that you tell your buyer, hey, as soon as you've signed it, I will send it over. And then make sure you let your client know as soon as you hear back, hey, congratulations, we're under contract. Send a copy to the buyer immediately after they sign things. SkySlope is great because it will do that automatically, but then you just need to remember to send them a fully executed copy. Make sure that once the seller accepts, rejects, or counters, that you let your clients know the next steps. Hey, the next step is your home inspection, or hey, we have 1 day to accept or reject their counter offer, or hey, they just rejected our offer. Would you like me to call them and see what a winning offer would look like? If you've done the legwork in advance, speaking with the listing agent, you can usually write a pretty compelling offer the first time and utilize verbal negotiations rather than contractual negotiations. Verbal negotiations are so much better because you guys can come to an agreement and then have the offer reflect that, rather than submitting something and just like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks and what they counter back on. That gets very documentation heavy and confusing. One thing, if the sellers want a higher price or they want to add money to the amount to cover your client's closing costs, make sure that you know if it'll appraise that high, because that will cause problems down the line if it won't. Love letters, when it comes to submitting an offer, love letters are a big nope. Actually, they're a nope if they contain any fair housing violations. No, my buyers want to raise their six children here. If your buyers really feel the need to do something and write something, they can write about what they love about the house. I've had buyers who are like, we really want to submit something. And then, I've advised them, hey, I'm going to read through it. If it has fair housing violations, I would not advise sending it. But I've had people say something like, the buyer loves to garden and the raised beds are so perfect, or the attached shop is perfect for my client's woodworking hobby. Those things can be included. But rather than sending love letters, sometimes I'll just put that in the body of the email to the agent and just say, my client absolutely adores woodworking. That shop is so perfect, because sometimes the sellers just want it to go to someone who will appreciate it. But make sure it's not a fair housing violation. Okay, for your guys's, I'm going to give you a challenge between now and the next class period. I want you guys to write down some sort of checklist just for you, things that you'll want to go through before sending off an offer. Whether it's checking blanks, whether it's um, visiting with the lender, whether it's, double checking with the buyer. Just make your own offer submission checklist so that you'll be able to go through your checklist on the fly, because sometimes it's fast paced and sometimes it's stressful. Especially the first handful of times you do it, it can be super stressful. So make sure you have a checklist in place that you can go through so that your offer is strong and so that your clients are protected, and so you don't look like a doofus for weird dates or anything that could have been caught easily with a checklist. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, well, have a good week. I'll see you guys on Thursday.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, guys.